My name is Scott Norrick. I'm excited to be with you tonight. And I've been researching my family history for about 30 years. And then a few years ago started my own company called Ancestral Past, where I help others with their research. But I'm a big believer that the best family history research is not just producing a list of names, dates, and places, but really understanding the context of how our ancestors lived. And one way of doing that is providing context of what was going on in their community at the time they lived. And as a way of an example, I have a grandfather who passed away before I was born, so I never knew him personally, but I did know that he had lived his entire life in a rural town in southern Indiana. I knew that he had dropped out of school after 8th grade and then went to work in the coal mines, where he worked for the rest of his life. And I was always interested in understanding the life decisions he made, why he decided to go work in the coal mines. But he was still living in 1950, so when the 1950 census was released 2 years ago, I looked him up in the census, and sure enough, it showed him living in that community, and showed on there that he had an 8th grade education and that he worked in the coal mine. But as I started looking at his neighbors, all of the other adult men on his page also worked in a coal mine and also just had an 8th grade education. And so I took it a step further and looked at his entire community of about 1,000 people. And it turns out in his entire community, about 60% of the adult males worked in a coal mine, and the average education was an 8th grade education. So whereas I was always wondering about the life decisions he made, it was really based on the time and the place that he lived. That was kind of what was expected of young men in his community at that time. So since then, I've been doing a lot of research on Midwest communities on the 1950 census. My eventual hope is to compile it all in a book focused on two things: occupations, what were people working at in 1950 and how that differed community to community. And I'm interested in sharing with you what I found on Racine there. But then also origins, where people were born, where their parents were born, particularly those coming from foreign countries, but also the migrations that were going on within America itself. So I personally don't have any ancestors that lived in Racine, but my wife did. My wife had grandparents that were both born in Racine. My wife's grandmother was the child of Danish immigrants. And so we've always spent a lot of time in Racine and been very interested in its history. So Racine is one of the communities that I've done a deep dive on, and so I'm looking forward to sharing with you what I learned, at least, just by looking at Racine in the 1950 census. So obviously we've got a small informal group, so please stop me and ask questions as I go along. If I said something you didn't understand, please feel free to stop me as we go. So just a quick overview of what we'll cover. Talk about the background of the 1950 U.S. Census. We'll then talk about what else was going on in America in 1950. And then I'll show you how I sampled the Racine population based on the 1950 census. And then we'll look at some of the data. There's a lot of statistics that I compiled, so I'll have a few pages that we'll just go through some of the statistics on Racine. We'll look at then the city of Racine versus the rural areas around Racine. So in my research, I not only looked at residents in Racine, but I also looked at other parts of Racine County. And you'll see a difference when we look at those that live in the city versus those in the rural area. There were two employment questions on the 1950 census. It asked everyone what their job title was and what industry they worked in. So it didn't ask what's the name of the company you work for, but we have industry information, and we can infer what some of those companies were. And then everyone was asked where they were born, so we'll look at that information. And then 1 out of every 5 people were asked where their parents were born, and so we'll look at that information as well. And then we'll have a summary, and then this presentation usually goes about 40 or 45 minutes. I'll leave 10 to 15 minutes for additional questions at the end. So just a quick background on the U.S. 10-year census. The United States government has done a census every 10 years since 1790. And they started in 1790 just as a way to do a head count to determine the number of representatives each state would have in the House of Representatives. If any of you have looked back at the 1790 census, and some of those are still available online, it purely was just a head count. It only listed the name of the head of the household and then how many other people were living in that house. And the government's done a census every 10 years since 1790, and it's expanded over time, more and more questions being added. And we'll go through a 1950 census form here in a moment. But because some of the census questions have sensitive information on there is a confidentiality issue that Congress addressed in 1978. And they basically said, we're not going to release the census information for the public to look at until 72 years after the census was taken. Because of that, the 1950 census is the most recent one that we can look at the details of. And the 1950 census was released in the year 2022, 72 years after it was taken. So the census has been done every 10 years since 1950, we just won't see it. The next one will be 1960, will be released in the year 2032. And then it's important to note that up until 1950, the census was still done pretty much exclusively by door-to-door visits. The U.S. government hired tens of thousands of census takers to visit every household and farm in the U.S. And they would spend about 20 minutes, asking and getting the questions back. Now, since 1950, the government's evolved to getting a lot of that information through the mail for much of the latter half of the 1900s, and then more recently, been using the internet. And now, you'll only get a census taker coming and knocking on your door if you don't submit the questionnaire that they sent you either through the mail or the internet. But because the census was done through face-to-face visits and it was someone jotting down the answers, there are errors from time to time on the census. You'll see maybe names misspelled or someone's age not being quite right. But for the most part, the census is pretty accurate. And I have found the 1950 census to be very accurate. If any of you have spent any time looking at old censuses, you've probably come across humorous names. I collect those, just two I want to share with you real quickly. I found both Merry Christmas and Frankenstein on the U.S. Census. So neither one of these are from Wisconsin, but two excerpts here. And, actually, my mom actually knew this Merry Christmas is from Indiana, but the Christmas family had a daughter named her Mary. And from Oklahoma, we have a family whose gentleman, his last name was Stein, and his first name was Frank, middle initial of Ben. So found both Frankenstein and Santa Claus, or Merry Christmas. I have also found Santa Claus. I'm not showing him here as well. But you also find the future famous. So this is three different excerpts from the 1950 census. They were all three young men in 1950. They weren't famous in 1950, but they all became famous. The top one is from Atlanta, Georgia. We have the King family. The 21-year-old son, Martin L. Jr. His dad was a Baptist minister. That was obviously Martin Luther King Jr. The middle one is from Scranton, Pennsylvania. And here you see 7-year-old Joseph Biden Jr., currently the President of the United States. And his dad was an automotive inspector. But what's interesting is Joe's Uncle Frank was living with them at the time. And if you look at his job title, he was an enumerator for the Bureau of the Census. So Joe Biden's Uncle Frank was one of the guys going around knocking on the doors getting the census information. And then finally on the bottom here from Manhattan in New York City, we have the Trump family and little 4-year-old Donald Trump. His dad owned a building construction business. Donald Trump's mom, born in Scotland, and they had an Irish nursemaid living with them at the time. So everyone that I have looked for, that I know that was alive and living in America in 1950, have been able to find on the census. Sometimes it takes a while search and find them, but so far I've found everyone that I've been looking for.
What does it say after Joseph Biden, quantitative inspector? What's the next?
That says automotive inspector, so there's two columns here, and I'll show you more detail when we look at the detail of the 1950 census form. But this first column is job title. So his dad's job title was automotive inspector. The second column is what industry, and I think it says auto truck industry. It says auto truck something.
Great. Okay, thank you.
The census was organized on a household by household basis, on an address basis. Is that what we're looking at here?
If you hold that question, I'm going to show you the detailed form here in a moment that I think will answer that question. But the short answer is yes. So before we look at the 1950 census form, and that's coming up in just a few pages here, just a little bit about what was going on in America in 1950. Population of America in 1950 was only 150 million. Today it's over 300 million. So obviously tremendous growth since then. Racine and Racine County have grown since then, but not quite doubled. 1950 was the year the Korean War started. When we look at, we're going to look at some military information because there is a military question on the census. The Korean War didn't actually start until after the census was taken. So April 1st was the official census date in 1950, and the Korean War didn't break out until later that summer. But we will see World War II and World War I information. Obviously, cost of living very different. Average cost of a new home, $8,400. Wages, average wages were just a little over $3,000. Very, very different cost of living. 1950 was the year that televisions really took off. 14 million TV sets were sold in the U.S. that year. That was 10 times the number sold in 1949. It was also the first year that credit cards were used and issued. It was sort of the height of baby boomers being born. Jay Leno, Stevie Wonder, Bill Murray, Julius Erving, all born in 1950. It was the year that an African American played in the NBA for the first time, so very different culturally. And Green Bay Packer founder Curly Lambeau had been the Packers coach since 1919, retired in 1950 from the Packers after 31 seasons. But it was the first census after World War II, and from World War II you have all these returning servicemen, and they benefited from the GI Bill, which gave the returning servicemen subsidized college education and subsidized new home loans, so more and more people were going to college for the first time, and there was a real building boom going on in the country at the time. Suburbs, new homes, new roads as the automobile was just taking off. So it was a very vibrant time, and so many new babies were being born at the baby boom with all of the servicemen coming back after World War II. I mentioned the official census date was April 1, 1950, so I went in and looked at the Racine Journal-Times from April 1, 1950, and right on the front page there, their headline was that the census is getting underway here in Racine, and then they had several pictures about the census process. So what they said is there were 109 census takers hired for Racine. They were all trained at City Hall or the post office. Over here, they're issued ID cards, so when they come to your house, they can show their ID card. Here you see the big portfolio book that the census takers had carrying. This is where they jotted down all the information. And it also said, again, that you really need to answer the questions honestly. If you don't, you could get fined up to $500. And that the information would remain confidential. While I had the April 1, 1950 Racine newspaper, I thought I would just clip some other things that were in that same 1950. I mentioned before it was the Hudson car, 1950 Hudson car coming out. But at the Rialto movie theater in town here, Ginger Rogers was starring in Perfect Strangers. There was an ad for Lawrence Welk and his orchestra. They were going to be live the next day in Waukegan. The Hotel Racine was promoting their Sunday dinner. I found this interesting. I've never seen something promoted with a half cent, but you could get shirts laundered for 12.5 cents. And a lady's suit at Levin Brothers department store for $44. So again, very different time. All right. Now I think to answer maybe some of your questions more fully, here is a more full copy of what that 1950 census form looked like. This particular one, if you look up top, is actually from Stevens Point, but the census form is identical. So Racine used this exact same form, as did the rest of the country. But here is where individuals are listed. And there would be 30 people on a page. Let me just pause and stop right now. I forgot, I have a handout here as I get into the data that, wouldn't mind passing them around. I think it's all on one page, in case you want to take any notes as I get into some of the data. But, so over here, there are street names and addresses. And so every household should be listed by street name and household. And so this first household just had 2 people. The head of the household and his wife. The next one also just the head of the household and the wife. This next one, head of household, daughter, son. And again, that same process, 30 people on a page, and then it would go on to the next page. I'm not going to go through the whole, every single census question, but what I've done in red here is highlighted the census questions where I did my research. So way over on the left, there's a question, do you live on a farm? Yes or no? So I sampled that. And that obviously, in the city of Racine, there was no one who lived on a farm. But obviously in the rural areas, there were still very significant farming going on. Here's the question, though, where it asks, where were you born? Now, it doesn't tell you a city, but if anyone was born in the U.S., it will tell you a state. So WIS, here for Wisconsin. Here you see Poland. So if they weren't born in the U.S., what country you were born in? Here's Illinois. So it's either, again, going to be a state or a country. There was a question over here, are you looking for work, yes or no? And that's where I compile some of the unemployment data we'll look at. And then here are the 2 employment questions. What's your job title? And what industry do you work in? So here you see rural teacher in a public school. So again, you don't get the name of the company they work for, but the industry. Now, I mentioned there were some questions that were only asked of 1 out of every 5 people. So this is the top part of the census page, and all of these questions here were asked of everyone. So all 150 million people in the U.S. should have this level of information reported. Some questions, though, they earmarked for just 1 out of every 5 people, and the way you can tell if the person is getting the supplemental questions is you see a 1 with the circle, 6 with the circle. They've got the little circle over there. Those are the people that are going to have the supplemental questions, and those were on the bottom of the form, which I'm going to show you now. This is what the bottom of the form looks like, and on the far left you see a small 1 circled and a small 6 circled. Those correspond to the same people we saw up top. So 1 out of every 5 people was asked, where were your parents born? Here, they don't tell you the state, but they do tell you if they were born in a foreign country. So here it's either going to say the U.S., or if not the U.S., a foreign country. Stevens Point, we had a lot of people from Poland. So you see Poland a lot at Stevens Point. Here is the education level. S6 is a 6th grade education. C3 means 3 years of college. Over here, it gets into the household income, the annual income, and the income would have been for the year 1949. And then here's the military service questions. Did you serve in World War II? yes or no? Did you serve in World War I, yes or no? And then any other military service, yes or no? So again, the ones in red at the top, those are the questions that I surveyed on Racine, and I've done it for quite a few other communities that we'll be able to compare the data to. So it's too time consuming to do this type of analysis for every single person in the community, so I took a sample. And the census is broken out into what they call enumeration districts or census districts. And a district was nothing more than of a size where one person, one census taker, could cover that district over about a 6-week period. And it usually had between 400 to 700 people in that district. So when I sampled Racine, I looked at 11 different districts that were geographically dispersed throughout the city and the county. I looked at 7 districts within the city of Racine, and then 4 rural districts. One at the far north of the county, one at the far south of the county, one at the far west of the county, and one right in the middle, to capture what the rural life is like. But my sample included over 5,200 residents, and I've done similar research on other communities throughout Wisconsin, Illinois, and the other Midwest states that when we look at some of the comparative data, it's pulling from those states. All right. So these next few pages are going to have a lot of numbers on them, but I'll walk through them with you. So there's 3 columns here. The first column is the average for those 11 districts throughout Racine County. So I'll show you in a minute how the city of Racine broke out, but this right now is the city of Racine plus the rural areas. Racine County compared to the Wisconsin average and the Midwest average. So the first one on there is, where were you born? So in Racine County, 72% of the people reported they were born in the state of Wisconsin. But that's quite a bit lower, as you can see from the Midwest and Wisconsin averages. So a little more transient in terms of where people are coming from. And you can see one of the big drivers there is foreign-born. 1 out of every 10 people in 1950 in Racine was born outside the United States. That's much higher than I typically see, particularly for a community of this size. For Milwaukee and Chicago, I see numbers similar to that. But usually, when I look at some of the smaller cities, it averages more like at that 5 or 6%. Yes?
Did you take a look at what might be the reasons in Racine why there would be more foreign-born here?
The short answer to that is my hypothesis is the amount of jobs that were here. And we're going to look at some of the employment information in a minute. But Racine in 1950 had a lot of very diverse employers and very low unemployment. So it looked like for people that were moving at the time, it was a great place to find a job.
A lot of factories.
A lot of factories.
Is there any ethnic distinction between any of these within the census?
Yes, and we'll go through those in detail.
I was just going to
Yes.
confirm that is
Yeah.
correct in my research through the newspapers. Yeah, it's
A lot of
because
factories.
a lot of the factory growth that we
Yeah.
had before World War II and after World War II.
And I appreciate both of your questions because the coming slides that I'm going to be going through focus on 2 things, is the industry and occupations we'll talk about, and then also how the foreign countries break down that people were coming from. Percentage looking for work, only 3%. That's pretty low, although it was low throughout Wisconsin and the Midwest. Education levels, though, were strong. I put an asterisk at that education level because that question was only asked for those people that are 30 years and older in 1950. So that education level is really for those that were born in 1920 or earlier. What was their average education level? It was roughly a 10th grade education level we're seeing, but that's higher than average. Slightly smaller number of farms in this county, and then the military service was kind of right on average. So this next page then, I'm going to break out the same data for those living in the city of Racine versus those in the rural area. And I do this because in almost every community I look at, you definitely see differences in the rural community. So a little more likely to be from somewhere else if you live in the city of Racine. Foreign born was 11% in the city of Racine. 7% in the rural areas. That's still very, very high for rural areas. I see a lot of rural areas where that number is 1, 2, or 3%. Foreign born parents, 38% in the city of Racine. And then you can see the income level quite a bit higher in Racine than the rural areas. That's true almost in any county I look at. The rural areas, the incomes were lower. Farming was not quite, and we'll look at some of the occupation data, but by far the number one occupation for people in the rural areas was farming in 1950. So very strong incomes in Racine. So you're back to your question, why were people moving here? There were a lot of jobs available, and they were good paying jobs.
Well, I know that because both my father and my maternal grandfather were born out of the country but worked in factories.
And what countries did they come from?
Mexico.
And what do you remember the factories they worked in?
Jackie's.
Yeah, yeah. Some of my wife's immigrant relatives worked for Case as well.
But my mother, I mean, it's kind of interesting because then my mother's brothers didn't work in factories. It's just the foreign born.
And where did they work?
Educated.
Yeah, the schools. Schools were a big employer as well.
College.
The other thing that I always see is World War II service much higher for those living in the city compared to the rural areas. And part of that is for those working on the farms, many of them were given deferments because they were involved in the food production business or they were supporting their family. So this is very typical in terms of the percentages being double for those living in the cities versus the rural areas.
The unemployment rate that you have there, the percent looking for work, is that seems a little high, like for post-World War II.
You know,
maybe my perspective is skewed from.
that's about average from what
Is
I've
it?
seen. So
Okay.
I have seen some as low as about 1.5%, but in the bigger cities, it's almost always at least 3%.
Okay, interesting.
Rural areas, oftentimes, that's a very low number, because most people are just, working
I
on the
figured
farm.
that it was lower in the rural area,
Yeah.
right, because they work their farms and, right.
It's interesting, because I think the U.S. government defines full employment at like 2% unemployment, because they always assume there are some people that just are always going to be unemployed.
Okay,
I think
yeah.
also by this time,
Yeah.
by 1950, the whole nation had moved into, and may have still been in, somewhat of a recession. There was a recession.
Yeah, I don't recall exactly that. In some communities, you definitely see where they may have had a factory closed, because you'll see 6, 7, 8%, but sort of 2 to 4% is kind of where they usually fall out. So I wanted to compare Racine, just the city of Racine, to a couple of the other cities in Wisconsin that have a fair amount of data. Obviously Milwaukee being by far the largest city, but I also have Eau Claire on here. Eau Claire is pretty representative of other small cities in Wisconsin. So I've also looked at Wausau, Wisconsin Rapids, Rhinelander, Watertown, and they all kind of follow in line with Eau Claire, but you can see Racine looks more like Milwaukee on a lot of the stats in terms of the foreign-born, the income, again, very, very high, higher than I see in those other communities. Looking for work was 4%, sort of across the board in the cities. Education levels higher in Racine than Milwaukee, and military service pretty similar.
So the factory corridor which is how I would describe it, would run from Racine up to Milwaukee. And the foreign-born, I'd be interested in knowing more about that in Milwaukee and Racine, because a lot of the German prisoners, or World War II prisoners, whether they're German or Polish or Italian, were actually imprisoned in Milwaukee County.
Well, we do
And
have a
many of them
big-
stayed.
Any state.
Yes.
Yeah, I've heard other parts of Wisconsin that's been true as well.
We did have a big POW camp in Sturtevant, though.
Mhm.
And Sturtevant.
Mm-hmm.
All right, we're going to start getting into the employment numbers now. So this was countywide, what people listed as the industry. And again, there are no specific companies listed, but we can, I think, make assumptions on what these companies are. So again, it's important to note that this is county-wide, so farming is number one. Almost every county in the Midwest, farming is number one. The rare exceptions of that are like Milwaukee County and Cook County and Chicago, which are almost all urban in the county. But farm implement manufacturing was number two, and certainly think Case was probably the big driver of that, but I think Massey also had a facility at that time. And some of these, you know, I have to do research on and look up what was here. Electric appliance factory, I found two that I felt probably fit that category. One was incinerator, which I think was invented. The incinerator was invented in Racine in the 1930s.
Mm-hmm.
But then also Hamilton Beach, Oster Blender were made here. So I think those were probably the two big ones that fit the electric appliance factory. Found a lot of foundries, particularly iron foundries. Looked like Bell City Malibu Iron Company was probably the largest. They've been around since 1882. But there was also the Iroquois Iron Foundry. Construction is almost always top 10 for any county I look at, and that's just because of the building boom that was going on at the time. Commercial printing company, that I'm pretty sure was Western Printing, and I think they were most known for the golden books, right? Yeah. Radiator manufacturer, looked like that was probably Young Radiator was the company, the big one at least. I think that's now a part of Modine. Wax products seems pretty obvious as S.C. Johnson. Auto parts factory, not necessarily sure what that was. And then public schools, number 10. And then you mentioned you had someone work for college as well.
Going to college?
Yeah.
And, yes, and my mother worked in public schools.
Public schools. Public schools is usually in the top 7 or 8, but because there's so many manufacturing here, public schools was number 10. But here, you know, because there were so many manufacturing, I list some of the others that were pretty prominent. An auto jack factory, that was Walker Jacks. Walker Jacks were made in Racine for 80 years. Auto factory, I'm not sure there was an auto factory in Racine, but there were in the Milwaukee area and the Chicago area, so those people might have commuted.
Kenosha,
Kenosha had the auto factory, okay.
Rambler at the time.
Local government is usually in the top 10. It fell outside of the top 10 here. But there's also a company that made hair clippers. Andes?
Yep.
Yeah, it looked like that gentleman that started that company started making those in his basement in 1822, but he was still going very strong in 1950. Tool factory, lawnmower factory, I think it was Jacobson Lawnmowers. And then hospital is usually a top 10, but it was more like 16 or 17 here for the county. This next page is the same, but I broke it out between those living in the city of Racine versus those living in the rural areas. Most of them are on both lists. You know, the big exceptions are farming, by far number 1 in the rural area. You don't see farming in the top 10 for those that live in the city of Racine. The commercial printing company, the publishing company, is only on the city of Racine list. The auto jack manufacturer is always only on the city of Racine list. And then the auto factory here is Kenosha. Probably people live on the southern part of the county. As I was looking up, looking up who some of these companies were, I just clipped some old pictures that I thought probably related to them. Upper left, the type of tractor being built around 1950 by Case. The one just to the right of the tractor, I believe, is a picture of the manufacturing facility of the Andis Hair Clipping Company. There's an ad for roughly 1950 for the incinerator, an ad for the Jacobson mower. I believe that's the Western Publishing and Printing Company facility. The blender from Hamilton Beach, and then the Young Radiator Company. I have a business background, so I'm always interested in job titles. I always keep a list of interesting job titles I come across. So just put down a list of some of the more interesting ones. The ones on the far left were all in the farm implement manufacturer, probably Case. The die sinker, that's someone that creates and engraves dies into metal. Cupola liner is responsible for the lining within a furnace. The other manufacturing, some of these I had to look up. A brazier is someone that joins metal parts or creates joints for metal parts. A finner in a foundry is someone that removes the excess material. So they break off the fins on a piece of metal. A chipper in a foundry is someone that chips away at imperfections. A toggler down here in the tannery, that's someone that stretches and dries animal hides. I love the ones that end in man, though. Those always all sound like would be good superheroes. The ink man, the ice man, the road man, the ground man, the yard man, the press man. First time I've seen someone with the job title of complaint man. I'm not sure I'd want that as my job title, particularly at the gas company. And then most of these I see in any community in 1950. A lot of jobs that have many of them are kind of extinct today, but bowling alleys used to have usually young men that would go reset the pins.
There were people back there?
Yes.
Oh, wow.
Yes, before the bowling alleys were automated.
Wow.
And I tell you, in 1950, I see a lot of pin setters.
Wow.
Yeah, it's usually like a 17, 18-year-old boy
Yeah.
type job.
Do you think it's, oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's neat. That's really neat.
Elevator operators.
Yeah.
A lot of elevators were operated manually. Typists, stenographers, switchboard operators, telephone operators, you see those. Switchboard operators, telephone operators, typists, and stenographers, very common women jobs in 1950. Obviously, 1950 was still a time when there were sort of distinctions between more male-dominated jobs and female-dominated jobs. Telegrapher, typewriter salesman, that's one you're probably not going to see today. All right, so now let's transition to look at the birth and parent birth information. So this first one, I'm just looking at the question, where were people born? And so let's start with this pie chart on the left. 72% reported they were born in Wisconsin. 10%, the small piece, said they were born outside the United States, and that remaining 18% said they were born in another state. So what I've done over here is I've taken the 28% that weren't born in Wisconsin and tallied up the four most common answers. Illinois, probably no surprise, being close to the border there, that your number one immigrant into Racine is a Chicagoan or Illinoisan. More than twice as many as next. But number two was Denmark, more so than any other individual state.
Minnesota.
Yes. So just by way of numbers, of the over 5,000 people that I sampled, over 300 were born in Illinois, about 140 born in Denmark, 130 born in Michigan, and 81 born in Minnesota.
Do you have the sense of the population of the city and the county in 1950?
The city's population was about 70,000, and the county was a little over 100,000. the time. Almost always I see the contiguous states being in the top 4. Most Wisconsin communities, I see Germany, in the top 4. Germany came out number 6. So those were the top 4. Then Iowa, then Germany, and then Indiana and Pennsylvania were the first 2 non-contiguous states. So here, I just looked at, for those that weren't born in the U.S., what were the top answers? Denmark, 27% of the people that were born outside of the U.S. were born in Denmark, more than twice as many as Germany. And then you see a big drop-off, Holland, Lithuania, and then Russia was actually number 5. That surprised me a bit. And those were followed by Czechoslovakia, Poland, Norway, and England. So really, Europe, and then specifically the Scandinavian countries, Eastern Europe, and Germany. Anything surprising about that?
Yes. This is here?
In Racine County, where people were born, if they weren't born in the U.S., the top responses. I will tell you, though, there were dozens of countries listed. So this was and I say that because sometimes I do this top 5 list and it will capture 90% of the people that were foreign-born because they were all coming from, a few countries. There were literally 2 or 3 dozen different countries listed for where people from Racine were born. So they were coming from all over, including Mexico, which, again, in 1950, outside of the really big cities, I normally don't see Mexico, but Mexico, I think, also saw China and Japan. But for the most part, it was Europe.
Do you think that's due to being our proximity to Chicago, or?
Probably being close to both Chicago and Milwaukee, but then just the vibrancy of the types of jobs. Yeah.
Yeah.
So this next one then, I did something similar, but looking at going 1 generation back, where were people's parents born? So for those people, and again, about 1/3 of people in Racine had foreign-born parents. This was the top 8 top responses for people that had parents born outside of the U.S. Now here, interestingly, Denmark and Germany were almost tied. Denmark just slightly higher than Germany. But both of those right at 21%. And then Russia was actually number 3, followed by Holland, Norway, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and Sweden. And then the next countries after those were Italy, Canada, and Turkey. Yeah. And again, similar here, though, there were a couple dozen countries in total in terms of where parents were born.
The Turkey would make sense. We have a huge, huge for me, but rather large Armenian population. And but I'm curious about the Germany, Russia, and Czechoslovakia and Poland, because the boundary lines always changed.
Yes.
And a lot of people really didn't know where their parents were really from, or what their DNA makeup was.
That's
in
an
those
excellent
days.
point. So,
That's why I'm wondering about Russia and Ukraine.
so the way that the census taker was supposed to ask this question is to report where the parents were born, what that area is called as of 1950. That's an important distinction because parts of Russia and Czechoslovakia and Poland, prior to World War I, were part of Germany. And so, but because Germany lost land after actually both wars, a lot of those boundaries changed, and other parts of Europe as well. Particularly around 1918, 1919, after World War I, so many of the boundaries changed. But they were to report what that place is called today. So the city they were born in what country is it called as of 1950. But my speculation is Russia at number 3. Most of those people in Russia were probably from that part of Russia that was a part of Germany prior to World War I. That's my hypothesis, for the reasons that you said there.
Well, and I'm thinking that those Russians, so-called Russians and Polish, were probably Jews from the area of I forget the name.
Well, Pomerania was a big area that's now a part of Poland.
The program,
Yeah, program.
right. So I know for a fact that there were many here in that era from there.
Jewish refugees.
Yep.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And so asking that question was kind of a loaded question, but we know better now
Yeah,
than we did then.
yeah,
I mean, I don't think many people being asked that question would actually really know.
yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. So this next page just shows how the top 4 differs from those living in the city of Racine versus those in the rural areas. And it's just interesting because Denmark and Germany just flip-flop. For people living in the city, Denmark was 1, Germany 2, but in the rural areas, Germany 1, Denmark 2. But then you see 3 and 4 were different between those living in the city of Racine versus the rural areas outside of Racine.
But the Germans really did the farming in Milwaukee County and then spread out. And
Yeah.
spread west until the Norwegians came in, and then they took over the counties in and around Dane County, that area.
Yeah, and actually this next page then, I just want to show you how the whole state of Wisconsin looked. And so here, I broke the state of Wisconsin into 4 regions: northwest, northeast, southeast, southwest. So Racine obviously being in the southeast. The southeast part of Wisconsin is where you have the highest concentration of German. 50% of the foreign-born parents for people in 1950 in the southeast part of Wisconsin were German. That's as high as, any state in America. Poland number 2, Italy 3. Denmark was 4, and that's 100% due to Racine. Wouldn't be that high if it wasn't for Racine. And you don't see Denmark in any of the other quadrants of Wisconsin, but Germany number 1 in all 4 quadrants of Wisconsin. But you see then Poland, number 2 in general, but then it kind of mixes between some of the other Scandinavian and Eastern European countries. Madison and Dane County I have in the southwest.
Oh, you do? Okay.
Yeah, and that you see Italy number 2, Madison area, a lot of Italian
Yeah.
immigrants.
Yeah.
What drew so many Danish immigrants to this, in particular, do you know? What was?
I don't know the history. Rebecca, do you know the answer to that question? What started the Danish immigration to Racine?
I don't at this moment. I did at one point, but my brain is blanked now that I'm put on the spot.
It's okay that it's just,
I think there was a crinkle factor there.
Yeah, so a lot of them like to make Kreml, and because there are a couple Kreml factories here, they all came.
No, I do know, I haven't actually found any of them, but we had a person who was from Denmark that came here to do some research here, and he had mentioned that there were advertisements in their newspaper through the Danish society that was here, encouraging people from Denmark to travel here for jobs because the land was good and the work was good.
That makes sense. And the other thing I was going to say is, in general, particularly in the late 1800s and early 1900s, chain migration was pretty common. That someone would sort of settle in an area, and if farming conditions were good and there were good opportunities, they would write back to their home country and promote it that way. And so, for instance, in I think it's Greene County, Wisconsin, just on the Illinois-Wisconsin border, sort of in the middle part of the state, very heavily Swiss, from Switzerland.
Yeah.
Yeah, you see
You have
that.
it in your southwest, so.
You see that here. This is driven by Greene County, but I mostly researched the Germans to Wisconsin, and you definitely see chain migration. And what's interesting is while Germany is number one on all four, if you look at what parts of Germany they were coming from, you would see distinctions there.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, interesting, yeah.
Okay. So, I'm going to start wrapping up here. Just some of the summary of, what I thought a lot of this data showed is that, for a lot of the measures we're seeing look like a typical Midwest and Wisconsin community, but there were some pretty strong exceptions. And Racine residents were much more likely to be first or second generation immigrants, definitely an immigrant city. And the income and education levels were higher in Racine than Wisconsin and Midwest averages. That second sentence is important because usually when I see a large number of immigrants in the community, usually the income and education levels are a little bit lower. It was actually the opposite here. Many vibrant, diverse employers. The diversity of manufacturers for a city this size was very surprising. So, for instance, Eau Claire, Wisconsin, like 30 or 40% of the people worked in the tire factories, one of the biggest tire factories in the U.S. at the time. But it was, again, 10 times as many people worked in the tire factory as the next highest. That wasn't the case in Racine. Very, very strong, diverse population of employers. The farm implement industry and the electric appliance industry were the two largest for the city, and then farming for the rural areas. Denmark and Germany were by far the top countries of origin for residents with foreign-born parents, followed by Russia, Holland, and Norway. For those of you that are interested in digging into the 1950 census or prior censuses earlier, I list here some of the sites you can go to. Ancestry.com is probably the most common. You do need a subscription if you do that from home. But your library here has the library edition, right? They can use it for free if they're inside the library.
You have to be in the library using our internet. So whether it's our computers or your own laptop connected to our Wi-Fi, that's how it works. And unfortunately, the library edition only does the United States history. It doesn't do any of the European history.
So it wouldn't have like the English census.
Right.
But it would have all of the U.S. census.
Like it'll reference those, but you won't be able to click on any of it to get access to them.
But I give you a couple other alternatives there as well. FamilySearch.org is the site run by the Mormon Church, the Latter-day Saints. That is a free site. You do have to register and set up an account, but they don't charge, and they have all the U.S. Census data on there as well. And then the government has a site that has it as well called archives.gov. I don't find their search tools being as good as Ancestry or Family Search, but if you're interested in knowing the history of the censuses and they give you a lot of the detail in terms of the questions that were asked and how we're supposed to answer them, archives.gov is a good site for that. Yeah.
I thought the Mormons also own Ancestry.com.
No,
They don't.
no.
The Church of Latter-day Saints just helps run Family Search because you have to trace your family history for their roles, but they don't store any of the information there.
Yeah, Ancestry.com is a private company that is actually owned by private equity investors. Some of the big Wall Street firms are the big
That's not
owners.
helpful.
That's why they charge a lot. I mean, it's very expensive now.
And I quit. I did quit.
Yeah.
Because it was costing, but I had no idea it was private equity.
Yeah,
firm.
no, that's a money-making venture.
That's not helpful at all.
Well, and then also through BadgerLink, you have access to Heritage Quest, which does have the city directories and the census records there. They just don't provide as much information. So it's a very basic, but if you want to look at the census, you can go through Heritage Quest, which is free to use in the state of Wisconsin as long as you're a library card holder or going to one of the colleges.
Yeah.
Um,
So, I hope you learned a little bit about life at Racine just based on the 1950 census. I know I did. I also hope maybe you're inspired to go take a look at some old censuses for ancestors and see what new information you can discover. I'm going to open it up for questions, but I give you my email address there. If you think of questions that you forgot to ask today, you can always shoot me an email. But with that, I stick around if you guys have additional questions or comments.